Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Orange Team Podcast. Today, we're going to talk a bit about Bethesda, what they may have done wrong with Starfield, and what the future looks like for them. We're going to talk a bit about Rooster Teeth, a legendary media company now closing its doors with one last season of Red vs. Blue, and why they were here. And last, we're going to talk a bit about the podcast and our intention for it this season. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of the Orange Team Podcast. My name is Mitch, he's Layton, and we're here to talk for a little while.
Yes, we are, and I'm glad we get to talk for a little while. What's been up with you?
Mitch? Well, not a lot actually. Normally we have okay, let's write down some of the things we've been doing maybe this past week that have kept us busy, but I've honestly just been busy. I've been working late every day, and that isn't to say working late on my day job. It is a project, but more of a personal project, not one that I would want to hype up and get people excited to see. It's more just for me and for giving myself the opportunity to move forward kind of creatively. Sometimes you just got to get something out that's been maybe stuck in your brain for a while. And that's where I'm at. So I've been burning the midnight oil to get this idea out of my head and to set myself up for more things to come in this next year and moving forward with Teen Dreams. But other than that, maybe watched an episode of the Fallout show, maybe played a little Fallout 3, which has been fun. I don't know if I mentioned that in the last podcast, did I?
Yes.
I've been playing Fallout 3 again.
I think you did mention it, because inspired by the show, you decided to start that up again, which is pretty fun. Yeah. I'm actually tempted to reinstall that again, or even start Fallout 4 just because it's a little bit more modern. But, we'll see.
Yeah, I will say Fallout 3 is rough, but it felt appropriate. Kind of as an opportunity to sit down with my wife and explore more of the world of Fallout, to start at the more recent beginning. She even asked me about 1 and 2, but of course there's unavailable on console. And so it was just easier for already sitting down at the couch to just be playing Fallout 3, and she'll point me around the wasteland and hide when I get just bum rushed by something, and it's awesome. It's been a lot of fun, and it's a good game. It is rough, and especially if it's your first exposure to Fallout 4 might be better as the shallow end of the pool. It's more accessible, more modern, like you said, looks prettier, etc., etc. But I've heard some people say that Fallout 4 is a great shooter, but a terrible RPG.
Interesting.
I don't know that I disagree with that necessarily. It's sort of just how modern games tend to develop, is if you've got a shooter element that just becomes the flavor that overwhelms all the other flavors. And Fallout has always been known primarily from 1 and 2, and then 3 to some degree, and especially New Vegas, as a very roleplay heavy game where you build kind of a unique class and get the chance to leave your mark on the wasteland in your own unique way. They have a lot of dialogue options for everything from a high intelligence to low intelligence build, high charisma, low charisma. The speech skill checks actually matter. And I just watched a clip last night of someone who did some crazy melee focused New Vegas build where they ran into a nest of death claws and killed 12 with what looked like a rusty metal pipe. And I mean, it's one of those games like Morrowind that you can kind of break over your knee if you play it enough and kind of know what you're doing. And that's always fun.
It's janky fun.
Janky fun, which Bethesda's known for.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the charm. I think that's actually, now correct me if I'm wrong because I didn't play Starfield, but to me it seemed like I didn't see as many glitchy Starfield videos like I used to see with Morrowind, Oblivion, or Skyrim. And I'm just like, is that game just too polished? It needs that jank, that game breaking element to make it fun and memorable? Or is it am I just missing something?
Too polished is not what how I would describe Starfield.
Okay, that's just what I
It
thought.
is very, yeah, it is very broken in a lot of ways. And I think that either it didn't gain the traction maybe that, Fallout and Skyrim and other games did. Maybe it's not as visually distinctive it's kind of realistic. They call it NASA punk. And I sort of enjoy the aesthetic, but it doesn't seem as fantastical maybe at a glance. And with the heavy loading screens, and you spend a lot of time on planets that are fairly sparsely populated. I think that's one thing that Skyrim and Fallout have in their favor, is that the play area is fairly well defined, and if you're honest about it, it's actually kind of cramped, but that enables them to make it more like a theme park where around every corner something's happening, something spawns, there's some tower or crypt or Deathclaw, waiting to keep you busy and to give you that next 30 seconds of fun. On Starfield, you'll end up landing on a planet and kind of having to find your next 30 seconds of fun yourself. And that may involve some wandering around, and that may involve some trekking over hill and dale, which is fun in its own right. There's lots to discover, even if it is procedurally generated. But it's not exactly, WebM fodder.
So
clip fodder.
Is it procedurally generated per save file, or is it procedurally generated by them and it's locked in?
So as best I can tell, it's procedurally generated by them. And when I say procedurally generated, it's not like No Man's Sky or something else where it's truly just an algorithm spawning planets. It looks to me like they've sort of massaged the algorithm to give them, okay, we've got this particular planet, and it is a hot Venus-like planet. And so they can kind of tune those parameters. But obviously, if you're going to land anywhere you want on the planet, it's got to be able to know within these parameters I need to spawn a however many square kilometers section of land for the player to explore. And that however many square kilometers needs to have a handful, maybe a dozen of significant points of interest. And so the procedural generation seems to be based around how those points of interest spawn and how the rest of the planet's kind of filled out. And some of the points of interest are themselves bespoke, like they were constructed, and you can tell a level designer went through and added NPCs and added quests and whatever, but it's sort of like that little chunk of gameplay just gets dropped in by the algorithm.
Okay. I was curious because I was thinking in my head, like, if it's just procedurally generated, that makes it hard to share experiences with people. Like, in the sense of, like, I mean, not that you can't have those, because obviously games like Minecraft, people have loads of shared experiences, even if they're not identical worlds. But in a game like a Bethesda game, there is a certain element of, like, talking to your friends about a certain mission or or just things that you experience that are the same. But if everything was procedurally made per save file, I feel like it would be a lot harder to... I don't know. I guess because I'm trying to figure out there was a lot of connection around the Bethesda games back in the day, and it was like everyone could talk about certain ways they did certain quests or missions, and it was funny, or you did it a silly way, a funny way, or a really epic way. And and this is just coming from someone who didn't play the game, because I guess to me it just didn't generate enough hype for me. I just, from the outside looking in, it just seemed like a game that just it kind of fizzled out really quick. I didn't see a lot of people really hang on to it the same way Skyrim did or Fallout did. So I didn't know if there was like what reason that could be for that. So
yeah, I think you might be onto something. And really, to be clear, it's only procedurally generated if you just pick a random spot on the planet and say, I'm going there. Mm-hmm. The specific, like I mentioned, significant points of interest, that's, let's call those medium points of interest within a given procedurally generated area. The major points of interest, like the cities and things on planets, are all bespoke. And so you and your friends as players can go, oh my gosh, did you find that particular abandoned city on that one planet where you can get... I think there was an abandoned building or something where you could get swim trunks as an equipable item. And that's like the only place in the game where you can, or one of the only places. And so there, you still have that opportunity to go, oh, did you find them? And I can point you right to where they are on that planet. But if you were to move the marker over and be like, well, I'm landing over here, it's going to procedurally generate you a zone, and you can't necessarily walk from that generated zone back to the bespoke zone.
Okay.
And I think that it's sort of maybe left a bad taste in people's mouth. Like, hey, this isn't quite as isn't quite what I expected. And
I think
there's marketing and there's
yeah, I think it's a tricky thing, the space genre of games, because like I'm going to keep going back to previous Bethesda games, but a game like Skyrim, where they have a very controlled part of the map, like Skyrim is a very specific section of a much larger continent that they just have concentrated the game to, right?
right. Yeah, so the continent would be Tamriel, and then Skyrim's one of the northern reaches. It's actually kind of on par with like Morrowind
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how northernmost it is.
So in that world, it's easy. There's a culture, there's races, there's ecosystems, there's things that they can kind of control and fill that with rich content that just feels like you don't have to travel super far to find anything. Whereas space, it's like if you really want, and people are like, I want like a realistic space game, and I want, to be able to go to any place on a map, and I want this and this. It's like, okay, but realistically, for a game developer to make a world, or make that much, world that's interesting, is near impossible. I'm not saying it is impossible, but at the moment I feel like to make it an interesting content that everyone's going to like, and you just keep finding stuff. So I think that's inherently a challenge in that genre that I think Bethesda just wasn't prepared for.
Well, so you bring up a good point. Like there's a audience of players that really want a hardcore space sim.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Starfield was kind of trying to go, hey, we can appeal to that audience and then make our own Bethesda RPG in the manner to which we have become accustomed. And the resulting space parts of it feel a little more arcadey and a little less appealing to someone who might be looking for that more serious space sim. A good example of a space sim game, like I know there's Star Citizen out there trying to be like a true MMO simulation. There's what I'll call like an MMO light, and maybe that's even doing it a disservice, but Elite Dangerous is a very, very good space sim game. It's not as hardcore maybe as some others, but the systems and mechanics it does present you with are executed very well. As an example, I had brought a friend of mine who had not played very much into Elite Dangerous, and I'm cruising around in my kitted out ships from playing as much as I have, and he had the starter ship, and he had basically just charted a course, and you're kind of hop between stars with your warp drive, so he's like, warp, 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 out of gas. Now, Elite Dangerous is the sort of game where it's not like you necessarily call an NPC over to rescue you or they're not going to be right there. It's like, no, you ran out of gas. You made a mistake. You're now going to deal with it. And running out of gas or fuel meant that all of his ship's drives went down, and that included life support. And so this timer started ticking. It's like life support remaining, in the habitable space, 5 minutes. So he messaged me and went, hey, I'm adrift and I'm right here. So I was able to real quick jump in one of my big ships that was kitted out with what are called limpets. So you can like shoot these little drones out and they can do jobs, which can be either to repair things. And again, it's just a little drone. I could have it repair my ship. I could have it repair his ship, whatever. And some of the limpets can be fuel transfer limpets where it pulls fuel from your fuel tank and presents it to whatever target. So I got my fuel transfer limpets and I warped out to where he was, and I was able to refuel him and get him back up and running. But that's the sort of game it is. It's that sort of gritty on the wild frontier of space. You could set a course and you could literally get too far gone very quickly where you're in over your head and you had no idea and you just lack the tools to deal with the situation you got yourself in. Starfield doesn't have that. I know that there was discussions early on that there was going to be some sort of a limiting fuel mechanic where you might have to, say, put down on a planet that wasn't exactly habitable, but it was the nearest one and you were running low and you have to synthesize some fuel before you can get back up and cruise on to the next planet. But I think I read an interview or something where they said, yeah, it didn't test well with some of our focus groups, and so we ended up cutting it. Whether or not it was actually a matter of development resources and making an assessment of what features do we keep and cut if we have to go gold by this date, it wouldn't surprise me if it was some manner of feedback they received that ended up having them cut it. And I think that's really sad because in my mind, that's like the first thing I would mod in is some more of those kind of survival elements, because that is space sims. You're out there in the black and there's no one coming to save you. That is what really engages that audience that would play those games, and Starfield just doesn't have it. So it's sort of a mediocre Bethesda RPG in terms of the procedurally generated content being not as robust and rich as, say, Skyrim. And it's a mediocre space sim. And I think that may be what was its undoing.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like it was missing some of the elements that people enjoyed from other space sims, and just, I mean, to be fair to Bethesda too, it's their first attempt at this type of game. I mean, people would argue with that because you have other RPGs, but I think this is it's a different type of game at the end of the day. And, you look at where like Elder Scrolls took off really, in my opinion, after Morrowind, which was the third game. You look at Fallout. Fallout took off at the third game, So, maybe Starfield, they learned a lot from this, and the sequel will just fix all those things. So
I've talked about this before in the first season. I think I did, about how Valve has made a lot of hardware now, and that every piece of hardware they made told a story, and that story, from the controller to Steam Link to whatever, all coalesced into the Steam Deck. And the Steam Deck is still just one step in their story onto a bigger and better chapter. I see that in Starfield. I see them experimenting with some different technology to make the world seem bigger, and to fill out the world with content that maybe an artist didn't manually place. I see some things that make me actually pretty excited for the future of either Fallout or the Elder Scrolls. The idea, one of the things that Elder Scrolls fans have wanted since Daggerfall is the ability to literally just be immersed in the world and go from one side of it to the other. Now, Daggerfall was just the region of Daggerfall. Prior to that, but the region of Daggerfall in Daggerfall would take 2 real-world weeks to cross in real time if you were walking, I think. And that was procedurally generated for the most part. Prior to that was the Elder Scrolls Arena, and in that game you could explore all of Tamriel. You could go from one side of it to the other, across every region. Obviously, it was sort of limited in what you could do. So Starfield, to me, tells a story of maybe Todd Howard wanting to end on the highest possible note, where he makes a next-gen Elder Scrolls game where if they can iron out the problems with the procedural generation and the way things were handled in Starfield, they might be able to fill in all that space between the major points of interest on the map. And you might be able to walk from Valenwood, which is a very southernmost region of Tamriel, all the way north to Morrowind, and then west to Skyrim, and then west again further to Daggerfall. And that would be awesome and a great swan song for his career, I think. And so at the very least, I see Starfield as an experiment on whether they can do that. I thought the procedural content was better than it could have been. Like, it could have gone wrong a lot of different ways, and it was actually fairly effective. I did enjoy just picking points on a planet and being like, I'm landing here, and then finding some stuff around there. To me, it seemed like an experiment to see, hey, can we do that in this engine that we've limped along for so long now? And if we can do it, obviously they were going, okay, well, how can we do it better next time? Because that's just what artists and creatives and developers do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm interested to see where that technology pops back up, whether it's Fallout 5, maybe allowing you to go from the Capital Wasteland on the East Coast all the way to New Vegas, or Tamriel.
I do think it's going to change. I think the open world genre is going to find itself changing, like as far as how it's developed, how they fill it with content, the way they, because the technology now. I mean, in order to make a game that big with the detail and fidelity and voice acting and all the things that we've come to expect now is massive. And so I think that there's going to be a shift in how that's developed and the way they do it, the time it takes to make it. I mean, obviously Elder Scrolls 6 has taken a long time to come about. So I imagine they want to, maybe they've used Fallout 4 and Fallout 76 and Starfield as all stepping stones to that, because they know the Elder Scrolls game is kind of their big game. Not to say that Fallout isn't, but I think that at the end of the day, Skyrim was kind of it's in the cultural zeitgeist at this point. It's so and even like the games before it, but like I think the Elder Scrolls is definitely their biggest hitter. So I think they wanted to treat that with a lot of love and care. So they're testing on other games, and then maybe we'll see. I'll be very curious to see when they finally announce something. Something tells me it's going to be on the next generation at this point. Like it's skipped so many. So
Yeah.
but well, we'll see.
Well, I mean, you do marketing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you haven't played Starfield, so it might be difficult for you to speak from firsthand experience. But let's say, based on what I said, I know that their marketing materials were kind of big on like, hey, you can land on any planet, anywhere you want, and do whatever you want. Obviously there's that friction between what marketing wants to say and what the developers are going, hey, I built this system. It works kind of like this. It's the best we can do. Do you feel like it was mismarketed, or do you feel like that they didn't bend the truth all that much?
I think every Bethesda game is a little bit mismarketed. If you just go back in time and look at some of the things that Todd Howard would say at some of those presentations and the what would actually get delivered, I think they have a little bit of a marketing issue there. But I think that's not exclusive to him. I see a lot of big companies promoting games and showing trailers for games in a form that you will never see. That it will never be what is the final game. Unfortunately, we've come to expect that now. But as far as how they marketed specifically Starfield, I mean, at first they had me hooked. I mean, just the original announcement of like, basically in my head it was like, I didn't want to call Elder Scrolls in space because like, you could say it's Fallout in space. And I think Fallout in space is a much more accurate depiction anyway because of the shooter mechanics and just that kind of element of it. But it's not Fallout in space. But I just figured, okay, well, they've clearly got the experience in, sci-fi and fantasy, but this is like a different type of fantasy, or sci-fi, sorry.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know. It's hard to say what I think they did all the right things. I think at the end of the day, like, because obviously a lot of people bought the game. It's just that the end product didn't deliver what people expected. So maybe it was false expectation, but I don't know. I think some of the expectations weren't even from Bethesda. I think people have played a lot of space type games that there is now an expectation of every one to hit that mark. So it's hard to distinguish between what is marketing problem and what is just. And I guess maybe I could say it is a marketing problem, because if you know that the expectation is X and Y and Z, right? You've got your Star Citizen, you've got your Elite Dangerous. I'm trying to think. I guess Eve, but I don't think they were ever going to try and emulate Eve online. That's a whole genre. That's different.
They actually did clone Eve, or it's weird. Microsoft did, and they called it Excel.
Yeah. Yes, I've heard it's Excel in space.
It's the weirdest thing. Yeah.
And so, so maybe they didn't do the market research to know but it's hard to tell again. But they were using focus groups too, and I don't know if sometimes I always wonder if focus groups are just a cop out Like, did they actually use focus groups, or if they did, like, did they actually listen to them, or was it like you said, like they just needed them as a cop out for why they had to budget cut in this place or that? But focus groups are. It just seems to me, and I think you might agree with me on this. It seems like a lot of times when focus groups get involved is when the creative spirit of something dies,
Yeah.
because they're trying too hard to make something for a specific
It's
audience
weird.
versus like
It's
creating
weird.
something amazing that
Yeah.
they think is cool, and then by doing that they actually end up creating something that everyone else will like, versus the other, you do it the other way around, because people don't know what they want. That's the problem. If you share something with someone and say, this is what is this what you want, and then they give the feedback, a lot of times you end up making something that's only good for that person versus just making what you think is cool. And a lot of times that's how good games get made. It's just, I think this is cool, so.
Yeah, I think it's so strange that on paper, the idea of a focus group is great. Like, you're making a open world role playing game. And so your team would broadcast like, "Hey, we're looking for fans of open world role playing games. Come down to Bethesda. We'll feed you lunch. We'll pay you $100 and you can play an early alpha version of the game." And that's always scary as an artist because sometimes, people start judging a product in its partially finished state. That's not fair, to anyone involved. But somebody has to. Somebody has to play test it. So you get this focus group. On paper, that focus group should be the sort of people you want to impress. That you want, hey, if they like what they're seeing, then we're on the right track. However, in practice, or, and again, this is sort of just like, it's just perception. My perception as an end user of so many products that went through these cycles of market research during development, like you were saying, there's a product and it might be kind of rough. And if you had a graph of just like quality or effectiveness at achieving its intended goal, the graph might look kind of like a heartbeat where it's kind of flat and then it spikes really high and then spikes down really far and then kind of comes back. Now those spikes mean something to somebody. The spike up might be the reason that is somebody's favorite game, that it does one thing and it does it so well, and it's so unique, and the atmosphere is interesting, and it's rough around the edges, but you can overlook it for how well it executes on its core promises to you as the player. Kind of like stories. Like there's so many TV shows or books where you tell people, hey, just get through the first one. The first season's not the best, but after that they really find their stride, And when market research and focus groups get involved, it's their attempt to bring up those lows, like the things that it does really poorly. Like, okay, well, let's get different perspectives and let's try to even this out. But in doing that, they also pull down the peaks, and they kind of like, it's sort of like, sure, the average best fit line is technically higher, but that game is not achieving and reaching as high as it could have. And granted, it's not failing as hard as it could either. It's sort of a weird, like, just acceptance of the business side of things. And you have to, especially at the scale that ZeniMax and Bethesda are producing games. You need each game to make millions and millions and millions of dollars. If you can, you might lose some of those hardcore fans because it really is a logarithmic curve. But if you can get more overall fans, then it comes out in the wash, right?
Yeah,
and that's unfortunate.
It could be, and it's hard to read because sometimes you'll look at the internet and you think that the angry mob of people that are sharing their opinions represents the majority, but in reality, there's probably most people played Starfield and enjoyed it, and most people bought it and kept it, and so they probably still made good money. Obviously, Bethesda is looking for like Skyrim levels of money from their games, which that's just an anomaly. Yeah. I feel like that's a game that somehow they've been able to keep reselling it and keep doing it. They can't keep getting away with this. But they, I think that, it definitely. I don't think it probably hit expectations, especially because you want the hype to keep going. And then I think what hurt too, and this is kind of a side note besides the game, was just and correct me if I'm wrong. This is just what I remember, is the way they were handling modders was a little bit to the detriment of the community. I believe they were trying to introduce this way for people to have to pay for mods, or there was just a little more restriction on it. And
were you talking about the Creation Club for Skyrim?
No, not Skyrim, Starfield. This is why I'm asking you to.
They might have tried to do the Creation Club again.
I don't. So this is where I say I don't. I'm speaking from someone who isn't in the trenches of this. I just read an article and like, well, that's weird. That sounds awful. I could see why people would be upset, and then I move on with my life, and then it just suddenly comes back into my head in a conversation like this. It's like, I could have sworn I remember hearing about this, but I need you to be my my fact checker before I get angry comments.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say I don't think that the Starfield Creation Club is out yet.
But I think,
but I imagine it's gonna work. Well, I imagine it's gonna work the same as the Skyrim one, and the Skyrim one did have that. On paper, the goal was to enable mod creators to get a little bit of revenue for their work. It might, depending on the size of your mod and how good it was and how much it was used, you could essentially sell your mods and then ZeniMax and Bethesda take their cut and then you get a cut. And it would have been a way for people to, because mod creators will grind for years and there's no money at the end of that trail. It's literally for the love of what they do, for the love of the game, to build a portfolio piece, whatever. The Creation Club, it represents, as with all things, something with the potential for such good, but that can also be warped to such ill. And I know that there was more involved there that I'm not 100% up to speed on. But I believe its final form was indeed that certain people can sell their mods through there, get a little bit of the money for it, and go from there. I think at heart, the conversation was mainly around, should mods ever be monetized? Because modding scenes have been responsible for some of the greatest innovations in gaming. Like Counter-Strike was a mod. Team Fortress was a mod for Quake. Most of the games I played growing up were mods of Half-Life. And I call them games without even a moment's hesitation, because they used the same engine, but they were complete top to bottom, what we would call a total conversion, where it was all new textures, models, audio, dialogue, gameplay, etc. The modding scene is sort of like a very libertarian thing, like keep your hands off, let us make our mods and whatnot. And the Creation Club sort of represents bureaucracy reaching into the modding scene. And so it's sort of at what cost, getting, because there were opportunities for mod creators to have a Patreon or a coffee or whatever it took to get them some donations and whatnot, but it wasn't really meant to be a major revenue stream. Mm-hmm. And so I can see that side of it.
So it was kind of a goodwill thing that it seemed like a good idea, but in practice it actually created more turmoil, and it broke the status quo a little bit of how things work.
I think that's it. It represents a violation of like the whatever implicit agreements existed between game developers, who release a modding kit for their game, and the modders themselves.
Well, the thing is, too, is once money gets involved, it's actually easier to regulate and control modders because they've taken money. So as long as there's no money exchanging hands, modders actually have a lot more freedom to get away with certain things, like putting Thomas the Tank Engine inside Skyrim. There's no intellectual property issues because there was no money changing hands. So, yeah. But that's the kind of thing where I think maybe it could have been like, hey, we're trying to help you make money, or it could have been shady in that, oh, we're going to make people entice them to want to make money, but then we can actually have more control over that. Who knows? It's a delicate balance. I think people looked at mods the same way they look at open source software. It's like, just keep it the way it is, because that gives us the most freedom and autonomy. The moment you throw money into it, it just seems to always soil the pot.
Yeah.
And so I just I don't know. It's again, I'm speaking as someone from the outside in. I tend to only hear about things when there's controversy and turmoil, because that's what gets onto the front page. So I don't know all the
Yeah.
intricate details of how that all worked. But now that's so something you mentioned earlier though. So you said Starfield doesn't have modding yet. Do you think that when that gets enabled, that will kind of maybe revitalize it a bit because people can go in there and give it new life, make it more interesting? Or do you think it's too little too late?
I think it'll make the small, dedicated community of people who are still playing and loving Starfield play and love it even more. I don't think it's going to be a particularly significant draw for people from the outside to start playing Starfield. It would be great for me to be proven wrong and for there to be one of those total conversion mods or something else. Like, I could see a case for, imagine a Serenity mod for Starfield where you can have a Firefly class, frigate, and you could, they recreate all the planets of the verse from the show Firefly slash movie Serenity.
See, now I want to buy the game.
And
Like if that was a
okay,
thing, I would buy
right,
the
like
game. You know what I mean? Like that.
it's
Okay.
everything's there. Everything is there. Even kind of the procedural mission system, so you could go land on a planet. It could be all Old West looking. You roll into town and like somebody's got a job for you to smuggle cows from this planet to another, right? Like that would be awesome. And all of the bare materials needed to create that experience exist in Starfield. Um, it's just a question of if anyone's going to do it. If they're going to step up, and it's not like I was bored one weekend, so I made this, or even, man, that was a real slow, lazy summer, so I decided to make this mod. It's going to be years and years of work, and especially more and more as we, back in the day, it would have been easier for someone to throw together some maps in a weekend, but the level of quality required to stand up to kind of AAA standards, it's very difficult for people to just kind of do that.
Yeah. Well, it'd be I don't know. That's the kind of thing where I could see like a couple funny mods get thrown in, and Donkey makes a video, and suddenly the game's alive again. But we'll see.
Yeah, I really do feel like it may have a renaissance, but I wouldn't count on it.
No, I agree. I don't think it's in its favor, but I've seen weirder things happen. So, but
Yeah.
anyway, well, I think we covered a lot of Bethesda, at least the first half of this podcast. Wasn't in the docket,
Yeah.
but that's okay. I love these off the cuff conversations. So, I'm trying to think of what we want to move on to. We've got a few topics here. Which one sounds more interesting to you, Mitch?
It's sort of retreading old ground, but so Rooster Teeth, the company behind Red versus Blue, and Ruby, and the Strangerhood, and so many other pioneers of machinima, or the art of using game engines as a way to film, essentially television or film. Movies, full-on movies. Like machinima as an art form was largely pioneered by the people at Rooster Teeth, and Rooster Teeth is finally closing its doors. They announced about a month ago, because Rooster Teeth is now owned by, I believe, Warner Brothers. They announced about a month ago that they would be closing it, but it's sort of like it's actually coming to an end now. And they had a live stream last week where some of the founders of the company came on, like Bernie Burns, Jason Saldana, I believe, and some others. I know they had a live stream before with some of the founders who were still at the company, like Jeff and Gus. And just seeing all those guys again, and this last live stream in particular was so focused on just the impact and legacy of Rooster Teeth. They even titled the live stream "Why We Were Here," as a reference to one of the first lines in Red vs. Blue, which is "Why are we here?" So it sort of became the period at the end of the sentence that was Rooster Teeth. They had the whole team assembled, and Bernie spoke, and they shared memories and pictures of recording studios set up in closets that they recorded, the first couple seasons of Red versus Blue with. Um, Talked about the different offices they've occupied. We started last season with sort of a bunch of people are on the way out, and we're just now walking into the room. What are we doing? Or kind of, we have the opportunity to consider the end from the beginning. It's just sort of kind of coming back around where it's like, all right, now we get to see. I don't know about you. I mean, I know you at least have a pretty solid foundation with Rooster Teeth. But it did, especially those early seasons of Red versus Blue, really meant a lot to me, and sort of my circle of friends. Maybe even before high school. Maybe we were far too young to be watching it, but we did. And then when Fear came out in 2006, they did a series that I think we still quote to this day. And it's just like, it's crazy. They talked about in the live stream how Rooster Teeth lasted 21 years and how for most demographic purposes, 20 years is like a generation, give or take, right? And so they're like, Rooster Teeth lasted for a generation. And I just think that's so crazy. I hesitate to bring up the kind of hackneyed cliche, I wish we could know we're in the good times before the good times were over. Because I think we're all pretty aware. Maybe I doubt you truly miss it entirely. You'll be aware, hey, I'm in the good times. Good things are happening. Like, things are looking up, I'm moving forward, etc. Like, you have some awareness of, hey, we're in the good times. But regardless of how aware you are of them, the good times will have an end. And that doesn't mean that there won't be good times after that. But, to everything a season, right? And so it's just, I'm excited for the final season of Red vs. Blue, which is being edited together as a movie, so far as I understand it, because they obviously won't be around to release one episode a week. They brought back Bernie Burns to write it, and Matt Hullum, who was the voice of Sarge and was closely involved with Red vs. Blue and Rooster Teeth. I think he was CEO for a while. But he's directing the final season, and I will be watching it. It's just so weird that right in this season, like, talk about timing, right? Like, I mean, you and I have had conversations for years where we've talked about, oh, well, someday we'll do X or Y or Z, we'll do this thing. And I have this dream and this idea and this vision and passion. And it's sort of like the moment that we kind of said, hey, we're going to do something. We're tired of waiting. All these other things that we had looked up to. I think you mentioned that earlier, like that we looked up to and were kind of formative for us, inspirational. The pioneers in these spaces are now stepping down. And so that just represents like a natural void to fill. Like, there won't be too many cooks in the kitchen. A lot of the cooks are leaving. But also, like, how do you live up to that? How do you do your own original thing?
You don't live up to it. That's the point. I don't think you do. I
make
think
your own thing.
I think that the idea of, because I think, I listen to a lot of these different creators in their podcasts and interviews, and nearly all of them didn't expect to get where they are. They don't consider themselves celebrities. They don't consider themselves like that they've reached this point. They're just kind of like, look, I'm just doing the thing that I love on a platform that I love, and it's working, and that's, I think, even what Rooster Teeth was, is it just started out as a bunch of guys doing some silly things. Never in their wildest dreams did they expect to build a company to the size and scale that they did. When I was watching that live stream, it really took me back to realize just how many people worked there. Like, I didn't realize just how big Rooster Teeth was as a company. So, I mean, to me, it's almost like the equivalent of if, like, Linus Tech Tips basically shut down. Like, it's just so many people. And So yeah, I think though, as we step in, it's not, wow, we got to fill these shoes. It's just you do your thing and you do it well and you enjoy it, and you don't try. It's kind of come back to that game analogy I was with earlier. It's like you have your focus groups. If you're just worried about what everyone else thinks and you're trying to think of like focus, if you treat other creators and view counts and stuff as your focus group, you're not going to make good content, at least content that's true to who you are. But if you just go out there and be like, this is a thing I like doing or like making, or just a genre of something that I like and I want to make something in that genre, you just do it. And you may find a niche or you may find a large audience. But either way, that's just, I think that there is room, and I think there's always room. So there's a YouTube group that I've been watching recently called Sticks, and they're not, I have to see what their oldest video is, but I don't think they've been on YouTube for a long time. They're a bunch of Aussies, and what's been getting them attention, they took a risk and they decided to make these videos that are basically like mini movie trailers for famous YouTubers. And they're really well produced. Like the level these guys go to as far as doing their research on the people and then finding lookalike actors and then like basically creating these whole movie like, backstories. I mean, and they're not made up backstories. They're based on their actual stories. It's fascinating, but they're new, they're up and coming, and yet their goal is to hit 5 million subscribers because Mr. Beast said if you hit 5 million, then I'll talk with you guys, and because they want to make a movie about Mr. Beast. And it's funny, but they've created a format, they've created this thing, and it's really well produced, and they're up and coming. Like they already have probably 650,000 subscribers. Every time they put one of these videos out, they just released one for MatPat, and it was really well done. Highly recommend. Check them out. Sticks, literally, as it's spelled how it sounds.
Okay.
But they were kind of these. Inspired me. I'm watching the behind the scenes. Actually, the most viewed videos are the behind the scenes of how they made these videos for these creators, and then they create a red carpet scenario to bring these creators in, and they rent out a whole movie theater just for them to watch their movie about themselves. Really cool stuff, and that's creative and original and different. And so I think when I see stuff like that, it makes me realize that it doesn't matter that it's 2024 and YouTube is, I don't know how old, coming up on 20 years old now. There's still room for people to come into the picture and create really interesting content if that's something that you're passionate about. They're passionate about this. Obviously, I dare I say they're kind of playing the system a little bit by tying themselves to people who already have fame and notoriety, but this is kind of what it comes down to the marketing side, is that the marketing is tying yourself to people who have viewers and followers, right? So they're building this product and they're using the faces and look of these people, but they're also creating a really good product. That's the key difference, right? Is that you can market the heck out of something, but if people buy it and it's garbage, then you're not going to sell this version 2. But these guys keep consistently making better and better content. And yes, they're kind of piggybacking on other people's fame, but they're doing it. And the guys, it's like they show it to those creators, and those creators love it. So I think that's, I'm sidetracking a little bit. My point was just that I think that there's still room for us. And it's good that, I shouldn't say it's good, but creators stepping down does provide room, but I do think that at the end of the day, there's still room for you. YouTube has become more of a niche-based platform. Where
it's not even about YouTube though, because think about it. Our podcast is on 2 platforms. 2 out of 3 are not YouTube. And
true. I use YouTube kind of as an example because we do post to YouTube, and that's where my head's at. But you're right. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple Podcast. And we're, hopefully get onto some other platforms too. And obviously, in my mind, you're a game developer. That's a whole other creation side of things. But again, there's indie games coming out all the time that just blow my mind. That just, I feel like there's always room. It's just it's a 2-pronged attack. You have to create a really good product, and then you have to make sure people know that it exists. You do both those things, you win.
Yeah. In my mind, we're not YouTubers, and we don't really aspire to be, or at least not in this package, right? Like, I feel like you and I have the potential to look at each other one day and say, hey, we've got this idea for X, Y, or Z, and go do it. But it probably wouldn't be under the Orange Team umbrella. You know, might be under the Theme Dreams umbrella. It'd be a different channel. It'd be whatever, right? But at present, I really don't feel like, you know, we aspire to be YouTubers. And so it's sort of like Rooster Teeth was more than just its YouTube presence. In fact, towards the end, its YouTube channel was struggling very hard. Like, I think they would get a couple thousand views per episode of whatever they were doing. And it's like, you know, they really were, especially in the early days, you know, before YouTube existed, how did Rooster Teeth take off? You know, people sharing videos. Like you're saying, it's sort of if you make a good thing and get people to know about it, they'll do the hard part for you and tell others, or like in Red versus Blue's case, literally give somebody a flash drive with an AVI file on it that has, you know, whatever episodes of Red versus Blue. It's just, we kind of made season 1 about that overarching narrative of a creative endeavor. I think we've mentioned it a little bit so far in season 2, but I really do see this year in particular, independent of season 1 or whatever, like this year is a year of change, right? And in a year of change, it can be scary and it can be really introspective at times and kind of really force you to confront who you've been and who you want to be and what direction you're going. And I think that there will always be lessons to be learned from those who have gone before. But as you said, and you know, it's sort of like, I know this to be a fact, but it's something that you kind of need to hear over and over and over again and remind yourself of, because it's so easy to get kind of caught up in the noise of everything. At the end of the day, it almost doesn't even matter. Like, I like having those people, creatives, groups, teams to look at, to model myself on, to go, hey, you guys did it. Like, you know, everybody, like musicians will say, oh, you know, I listened to this band and it really inspired me and I really never thought about using, you know, synths in that way or whatever. And so then I started making my music, trying to make music like their music, right? Like, everybody's got that story. I don't know. It does put you in the headspace of like, well, how do I live up to that? And like you said, you got to just make your own thing, but easier said than done, right? Like it's real easy and trite to be like, oh, you know what, you just got to make your own thing. But in your head, you're always going to be potentially, unless you're extremely self-confident. Like we know a few people like that who probably never second guess a decision they've made in their lives. And honestly, it's working out for him. Like, look at him go. But for me, at least, I'm just, like Red versus Blue said so many years ago, why are we here? Right? I would like to be able to host a live stream in 20 years titled Why We Were Here, where you and me and anyone else associated with what we're working on can come on and talk about, hey, this is why we were here. This is why we did what we did. And this is how we made what we did.
Hopefully under, and that's kind of a better scenario than them.
Hopefully under better scenarios. Let's not get bought out by Warner Brothers, whatever we do.
No, I think we stay the Valve route where we stay our own entity.
You stay indie all the way.
Yeah.
And so far so good, right?
Yeah, you know, I understand what you're saying too. It is easier said than done when it comes to, you know, you don't want, you know, it comes to comparing yourself to people who've come before you. But I think, and maybe this is just me speaking, because I have spent so much of my life comparing myself to others, which has held me back. For the first time in my life, I've kind of stopped listening and paying attention to a lot of other people. And that's made me feel like I have more creative freedom, because I'm not thinking, oh, has someone else already done that? Because what I've started to realize is that everybody is doing something and even if they're on their own little bubble, they'll create something and it will be similar to someone else, whether they mean
Yeah.
to or not. And it's like you just have to. But if you create it with your own love and passion and care, people won't care if it's similar. They may like that it's similar to something else, as long as it's not a direct copy. But if you're creating your own thing without considering what other people do, there's a lot of creators I've followed that I am shocked when I find out, like people who make videos and film who don't watch a lot of video and film. They don't see a lot of movies, and yet they go out there and create amazing things, partially because they're not burdened down by the feeling of like, oh, there's all these other people and they've done this and I can't do this because they did that. They just go out and do it, and it's people are like, oh, that's kind of like this thing, and they're like, oh, really? Let me go check that out. Oh, it kind of is. And but then people still love it. And so I don't know. I'm trying my best to just say, this is a thing I want to make, and then just don't focus on what everyone else has made. It's kind of like this podcast. There are so many people making podcasts. There are loads of white dudes making podcasts right now. And, I think about that too. And I was like, oh, man, we're just another podcast going out there. But I mean, we didn't make this with like the intent of it, like, oh, we're going to make it rich. We're going to be big. It's like some people got there like, we got to make a podcast because it's trendy. It's like,
Well,
I made a podcast because I want to talk with my friend for an hour once a week.
Exactly. And it's more this, sometimes you have to do things for the experience of doing them. It's almost like, hey, this podcast or the project that I'm working on and like haven't slept well in months because of, sometimes you have to do something not because you're going to share it with everybody, not because it's going to be your big break. It's like you need to teach yourself the discipline, the skills, you need to do it because it needed to be done. And because getting it done then enables you to move on to the next step of your journey. And so this podcast, like you said, it is absolutely just for us to talk once a week. And if that's all it ever is, then it has served its purpose and will continue to serve its purpose. But there is always that mentality of kind of, okay, we've done this thing. Well, what do we do next? Like where are we going next? What's next on the agenda? And like you said, there's tons of podcasts like this, but to some degree, this podcast exists because the podcast I wanted to listen to didn't. I wanted to listen to friends talking about tech and gaming and whatnot, and I used to get some of that from different podcasts. I used to listen to the Penny Arcade podcast, what did they call it? Extra Panel, I think. Like, and it would basically be them with a mic on while they talked about the process for writing and drawing the comic, so for each comic you'd have an episode for it, and you could see what conversation gave rise to that particular punchline or whatnot. I used to listen to the Bungie podcast because I wanted to work in game development at Bungie, but I discovered real fast that while I loved hearing about the different tech they were working on or how they were up all night trying to get the water physics just right, I loved just as much hearing a bunch of friends in a room with very similar interests to me talking about the things that interested them. And podcasts are kind of like overproduced, right? Like if you just go cruise the podcast store, they're always trying to sell you something, or they're always seeing it as their big break, or they're always seeing it as like, oh, this is our thing. And for you and me, and I want to be very careful to preserve this, it literally is just us talking. Like, and I think that's all it should ever be. I think if we quote unquote got big, we should probably spin off another podcast to handle that. Like, oh, hey, from the creators of the Orange Team podcast, here's our heavily produced and scripted one. And then this will always just be us talking, and that's a big if, right? But because this conversation is exactly what it's supposed to be,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Yeah, I enjoy this, and I think for me this is a creative endeavor. Just because
Oh
the
yeah.
time we take to think up topics. So, ironically, today has been more of a ad lib, which I've kind of enjoyed. I kind of want to keep it that way for this season too. We
Yeah.
have lists of topics, but I like the idea that we can just continue
I f-
talking about something. We don't. These are just more there in case we have a brain fart.
yeah, I feel like the first season we did have that really, like, as much as from humble beginnings, we did have that tension of, hey, we've got to produce something, we've got to perform, we've got to like have the topics. I really like the idea of season 2 being about getting back to basics of like, we're literally just like, we do have a list of things that were on our minds that we may or may not get to, but each episode's going to be kind of what it's going to be,
Hmm.
and I think that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely topics I'm looking forward to covering with you, and there's topics that have been brought up to me from listeners, the things they'd love to hear, segments that they'd like to come back, and I do want to kind of continue to do some of that. Obviously, we appreciate the people listening,
Absolutely.
and there are subjects and segments that I enjoy. So we will continue to evolve this podcast and develop it. But yeah, we're trying to keep it from becoming too rigid, too structured to the point where we're not really enjoying it. We do have lives outside of this, so we can't afford too much energy to devote to this. So we apologize if that's a turnoff for anybody, but too bad it's not for you. And we're just having fun here. Today I think we're both been very busy, so the energy is a little lower, but we're still just chilling. We're just chilling. We got stuff going on. We're I don't know. So I don't know where we're at. I'm looking at the timer. I think we're coming up on the end
It's
here.
about time.
It's about that time. Well, everyone, thank you very much for listening. We appreciate you all. Thank you for sticking out to the end. And if you guys have any suggestions for us, leave a comment, like, subscribe, follow YouTube and Spotify, Apple. We're on Facebook. And yeah, that's it from me. Mitch, any other closing comments?
Nothing in particular other than don't forget to go make something this week. If you've got a story on your mind or a song that you want to finally record, even if it's just recording it into your iPhone, if you've got a podcast idea, go do it. Just start it. This is a year of change, and I think a year of positive change. And I'm excited to see what you all come up with.
Yeah, definitely. If you guys are creating something, please share that. That's something we'd love to hear more about. And yeah, well, until next time, I'm Leighton. He's Mitch. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.